If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. People are still trying to come to terms with the flop heard round the world. The fall of Kamala Harris, again, has hit with a thud, but it shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone with half a brain cell. The black media's been telling you for the longest time that all of this overhyped nonsense about Kamala's just owning Trump in the polls, why she's got all this massive support. Oh, those pesky black men who were saying that they weren't going to vote for her because she wasn't offering black people anything. Oh, they've changed their minds. They've done it about face. It was all Barack Obama's finger wagging that made it happen to. Everything they said, all a pack of lies. And if you want to know who to blame for this, you can blame the black vote. Because here we are, a decade after the failure of Barack Obama, and we got black folks who said, you know what, we've had enough. A critical mass has finally been achieved. The reason that Kamala Harris lost is twofold. One, the black vote that actually turned out 4 years ago in the wake of the 2020 uprisings, those black cities stayed home. No matter what the white media and their bootlick surrogates may try to tell you, the states don't actually go for Democrats, it's specific cities that do. Michigan didn't go for the Democrats 4 years ago. Detroit and Flint did. Pennsylvania did not go for the Democrats 4 years ago. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh did. And of course, Georgia, which is a blood red state, the home of Newt Gingrich and Marjorie Taylor Greene, for God's sake. Clearly, that gang of reprobates didn't go for Biden 4 years ago. It was Atlanta that turned out in force that for a night made Georgia a blue state. That's what everybody knows. It's those black enclaves that does it. So I don't want to hear anything about the Arab vote in Michigan. There's simply not enough of them to turn the state of Michigan blue or even purple, even if they all turn out. And I don't want to hear anything about Latino votes either because they're mostly in the red states. States that the Republicans were going to carry anyway. The only states that matter are the swing states. And that's where the black enclaves are at. That's the hinge that the elections turn on. Black voter turnout. And we all saw what was going to happen. In my comprehensive post-mortem of the 2024 presidential election, I pointed out to you that early voter turnout was actually down 25% from what it was 4 years ago. Early voter turnout favors the Democrats. That's largely because you got all of those black folks, working class people who simply don't have the leeway to be able to take off from work whenever they want. They happen to need as much time as possible to get those early votes in. The actual election day, on the other hand, favors the Republicans. And in a political environment where only a few million votes makes all the difference in the world, when you have 30 million votes less in early voting than you had 4 years ago, what that means is the Democrats were already underwater before election day even came. And that was because the black vote stayed home. You can go ahead and credit or blame the black vote. We really don't care. There's been a whole lot of people counting on black folks doing what we did 4 years ago, having our knees knocking and our brains turned off just long enough to step into the voting booth and vote against our interests. But black folks stood on business, something that we haven't done nearly enough, but we did it at least this once. And all of those folks out there who thought they were going to be getting something from President Kamala Harris, here they are, mad as hell. All those goodies that they thought they were going to be getting, Joe Biden promising he's going to do this, that, and the third, which he was never going to come through on. A lot of folks out there thinking to themselves that their student loans were going to magically disappear. Biden's had 4 years to do it. If he was going to do it, he would have, but he didn't. And on top of that, you had other stuff. People actually thinking that there was going to be some sort of healthcare reform. Forget it. Even if Biden wasn't completely senile at this point, this man is clearly not crafting any major legislation at this point. Certainly not on his own. He just sits there while his Democrat handlers write out for him, this is the stuff we want you to go ahead and get in front of the cameras and mumble and stumble and bumble. I've even heard a rumor, by the way, from some of the more devoted Democrat shills nutting up, claiming that there's going to be some sort of sex strike, apparently in relation to this election. Now, first of all, in the age of TikTok and social media, you have the predictable phalanx of fools who have been out here doing these over-the-top reactions to the election, shrieking in their cars, screaming and yelling. It's clearly staged, clearly fake, clearly phony. They'll do anything to get clicks and views, and that's fine. But on the other hand, you do have a handful of people who thought to themselves that they were going to be getting themselves a job. And that being the case, you got some folks who aren't much to write home about in the looks department, and I guess they're calling themselves doing some dirty thirst trapping. So they're sitting here saying to the world, I'm going on a sex strike, as they sit back and see if there's any dusty dudes or dusty dudettes, in some cases, who will get in their DMs and hopefully say, oh, I know you ain't gonna hold out that long. Why don't you let me come over and keep you some company? So you got all these fools who are trying to use this for their own personal benefit. This is the American political landscape as it stands today. I only point this stuff out because it's important to note 15 years ago, the black media started off with a mission that was twofold. First of all, to take control of the political discourse within the black community, and second of all, to elevate the debate. Now, when you look at the current political discourse in America across the board, what do you see? You see a landscape dominated by lies from the white media, but you also see that there's a whole bunch of folks out here who are calling themselves scrambling for crumbs underneath. We're talking about these would-be social media influencers. We're talking about these would-be online bootlicks. The black media has to make sure that we distinguish ourselves from these people. We don't want them anywhere near us, and we don't want anyone trying to say that we're anything like them. Now, what comes next? What's going to be happening now? Because all these people are saying, oh God, it's going to be 2025. The Fourth Reich is right around the corner, etc., etc. In times of crisis, you can tell who's honestly seeking progress and who's just seeking more of the same. Instead of being honest with viewers about what's actually happening, instead the white media has chosen to stick to the script. The more reality threatens to intrude, the more they plug their ears and sing the same old song. Kamala Harris was sitting there crying in her beer alongside Governor Gretchen Whitmer, commiserating about how she wasn't able to get male voter support. Neither one of them would dare ask why white women weren't supporting Kamala Harris. You would have thought they would. Under white supremacy, you're not allowed to indict any portion of the dominant society on anything. But by the same token, you're also not allowed to actually connect the phony gratitude that some phony leftists like to give. Well, the black community, they came through and saved democracy. Well, what's the reward that the black community gets for saving democracy, quote unquote? What do we get? We get ignored. That's what we get. Meanwhile, the very people who imperil democracy time and time again, such as the white female voters who keep voting for the Republicans, voting against their own interests, quote unquote, those individuals, they do get rewarded. They do get something. But the truth of the matter is, those white female voters, they were not voting against their interest at all. Abortion wasn't their interest. Why? Because their privilege and power and position in the world is not based on whether or not they got access to abortions. It's based on whether or not they're classified as white. That's what their social status is based on. That's what they were protecting with the orange man. They know exactly what side their bread is buttered on, even if the white media likes to tell you that they don't. This is how the white media has handled this entire election, cocooned in their studios, surrounding themselves with a bunch of yes-men and suck-ups, Michael Steele, Al Sharpton, and other boomer bootlicks, all of them using fancy words and what for them seemed to be sophisticated-sounding anecdotes about how reality cannot possibly be what it seemed. Just because it looked as if the orange man was about to have a huge political victory didn't mean it was going to happen. Not again. It can't. They can't believe it. Why? Because they spent so long telling you that it couldn't possibly happen, that it shouldn't happen, that it mustn't happen. It was all one big massive exercise in denial. But then again, as I've always told you, the white media isn't in the business of entertainment. They're in the business of mind control. That's the reason why they can carpet bomb you with propaganda, which they know is completely and thoroughly fake, and then they sit back and wait to see whether or not you're buying it. Both the white media and the Democratic Party work for the same corporate interests, the same advertisers who the MSNBCs and other outlets are catering to, the same corporations that the Democrats want money from. So they all stick to the same script, because they're all puppets under control of the same puppet masters. The Democratic Party leadership aren't the only ones sticking their heads in the sand. It was obvious to the people which way things were going, even if the white media wanted to pretend otherwise. They're sitting here whining that Trump used podcasts and new media to win the election. Okay, well, Kamala also tried to use podcasts and new media and Zoom meetings and such. She tried to use the internet, and it didn't work. She went on the Shade Room, Charlemagne the Fraud's little sideshow, Shannon Sharp. She was making the rounds on podcasts just like Trump was. You got the left corner of the white media reporting as if Trump was doing something dirty or underhanded by going on podcasts, as if he had access to some new technology that Kamala Harris didn't, as if it was unfair. The reality is Kamala was running and hiding from interviews. That's what she was doing. She only wanted to go on podcasts where it was pre-established in advance that there wouldn't be any tough questions and that she could spout her talking points without any sort of opposition or question. You see, Joe the racist Rogan refused to give those kind of assurances. That's why she didn't want to go on his show. And besides, Kamala Harris sucks at interviews. She knew it. Her handlers knew it. As the current vice president, she's had a lot more chances to go on podcasts before July of this year. But she chose not to. And once she was handed the nomination, the podcasts that she chose to go on were irrelevant. Shannon Sharp is, at best, and I put best in quotes, a celebrity gossip podcast. That's what he does. That's it. And as for those other toilet bowls that Kamala went on, they were DNC auxiliaries and everyone recognized them as that. They have no credibility. People, especially black people, already knew that there weren't going to be any substantive questions asked. She wasn't going to be confronted about her record on anything, and they weren't going to peg her down on all the tons of broken promises that she and Biden had made. And considering the crappy state of the economy and how black people's condition hasn't been helped one iota by having her in office, she needed to be put on the spot about what she was going to do as president that she and Biden haven't already had the power to do. See, that's the one question that didn't come up. The question that thinking people were asking. Whenever Kamala would give her stump speech, everyone's thinking, well, you're already in the White House now. Why are you saying that you'll do something next year when you're already in the White House? You've been there for the last 4 years and haven't done any of these great things you've been talking about. That's been the elephant in the room. She's sitting here talking as if she wasn't in office when she's the one in the White House. The problem isn't the podcast. The problem is Trump actually went on real podcasts and answered real questions, and Kamala Harris tried to stick to safe spaces. It reminds me of the video that I did about why Roger Ailes isn't going away. Richard Nixon made it a point to avoid going on television, especially for political purposes. And why was that? Because he got humiliated in his debate against Senator John Kennedy. And that being the case, as far as he was concerned, I'm not concerned with this television thing. This television thing is stupid. It doesn't even matter. When the reality is he sucked at it. And he didn't want to have to admit to it. That's why Roger Ailes, who was Richard Nixon's media advisor, set up a whole bunch of cocooned, closed-off safe spaces for Nixon, having the quote-unquote town halls, where the audiences were completely and thoroughly filled with Republican operatives and volunteers. Everybody who was there was vetted to make sure that nobody humiliated Nixon, at least not on television, and that's what Roger Ailes had to do to make things safe enough for candidate Nixon to actually get in front of TV cameras. Kamala Harris tried to replicate the exact same kind of phony, fabricated safe space, but it didn't work. Not with the masses, it didn't. When you see the white media beginning to cast aspersions on podcasting, just understand, just like with Me Too and Time's Up, they're going to find a way to try to turn this against black people before it's all over. Because they know why it is that their chosen candidate didn't win the election. They know why the orange man's going back to the White House. It's because you have a resurgent black media who's out here, who's actually getting black people on code, telling them what the real issues are, informing them as to whether or not candidate so-and-so actually does have a record that we should be voting for, and if not, telling them what questions need to be asked. We're getting people's minds right, and they don't want that to happen. They've lost their monopoly, and they hate who they've lost it to. So as they see it, they're breaking the ice on taking down podcasts, but that's actually meant to come after us, the new voices of black media. So I think that one of the consequences that's going to come out of this election cycle is that the white media is going to have, I think, a critical mass of people who are finally soured enough on them that they're not going to be really paying attention to them. Younger people, in particular, those who have been under the age of 40, have been turning increasingly to online outlets because they know that they can't trust anything that they're seeing on television. But I think that process has now been accelerated. Whether or not it's going to become permanent is another question altogether. But it's not just the Democrats who took a loss. There are white media outlets and mouthpieces that were sitting here pushing the propaganda. They've also suffered a terrible, if not necessarily fatal blow. You see, Donald Trump didn't just win the Electoral College vote this time around. He won the popular vote as well. That means more voters chose the orange man than chose Kamala Harris. Again, this is the orange man's third try at bat, and Kamala Harris is the one who lost more votes to him than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. How the world do you pull that off? How do you go through what he did on January 6th, the criminal trials, the civil judgment against him for rape, the endless constant demonization, and then you not only run for office, but you beat the same people who you ran against 4 years ago? I told you back in 2020, if Biden had run against anyone other than Trump in 2020, he would have lost. But he only won because Trump's administration had been thrown into disarray by the dual wallops of the 2020 racial uprisings and the once-in-a-century pandemic, which wreaked havoc on the economy. Had it not been for those factors, Trump would have won. Mail-in ballots favor Democrats, as does early voting. Both were at record highs due to the pandemic and social distancing. But that wasn't the case this year. One thing's for sure, though. After this, the Republicans griping about how mail-in ballots are all rigged will carry a lot less weight. That's not to say that they'll stop whining about it. They never do. But it does mean that even their own voters will find it far harder to get a full head of steam about it, considering that Trump had such a lopsided victory. But I'm not here to talk about them. I'm here to keep us on point and on code. Black voters spoke last Tuesday, and we came from a position of strength, not fear. It's time for us to double down on that. The shills and plants, they know that we're right. The Asian candidate wasn't offering anything. She tried desperately to be a professional bloviator, to master the art of talking a lot but saying nothing. In other words, she tried to do what Barack Obama did. Except she doesn't have his bogus charisma or his ability to pretend to be saying something really profound while he's actually saying nothing at all. Kamala was desperately acting like she was making a valid point but didn't have the words or the delivery with which to do it. It was fake, her gravitas was forced, and everyone could see it. Voters know who's responsible for their problems. They know what issues they're concerned about, and they're waiting to see if Kamala would be responsive to any of them. She categorically told them she wouldn't be. And even though the voters may not be able to explicitly tell you precisely who, from BlackRock to Blackstone, is paying Kamala Harris for her silence, they know that she went out of her way to avoid saying anything about all of these shadowy economic forces that are wrecking their lives. And her silence was deafening. Black voters were demanding that Kamala actually say she was going to address their real concerns. And the more word salad that she gave, the more talk that she gave, the more it was obvious she was going to just sit here and try to talk them to death, the more they looked and realized she's not going to do anything at all. She completely and thoroughly demoralized her own base. She tried to BS her way past the electorate, and it didn't work. You've got black people out here facing real problems, the price of gasoline and groceries, and the very people who the Democrats sold out to are the ones responsible for this. Kamala and the Democrats are trying to serve two masters, and as we all know, that never works. People invariably have to choose one master over the other, and it's usually whomever they think they're going to get the most from. Democrats have engaged in a 40-year-long project to appeal to the same cash-fluid captains of industry and finance as the Republicans. They made the cynical decision that they would talk populist in front of the cameras, but govern conservatively once in office, because that's what the most established deep pockets want. Conservatism means nothing changes. And when the condition of the masses keeps getting worse and worse, change is what's called for. Not so long ago, after black voters handed Trump his rat's nest of a toupee on a silver platter and handed Democrats control of Congress, the white leftist media narrative was that Trump had led the Republicans to destruction and that they would go the way of the Whigs. I remember Joe Scarborough, of all people, claiming on his show with all of the pomposity he could muster that Trump wasn't gone, but Trumpism is. And I told you that he was wrong on both counts. Neither the Orange Man nor his putrid ideology were gone. Democrats had gotten a momentary reprieve, a stay of execution, but it wouldn't last. I told you that if they went and repeated the mistakes of Obama, and that they decided they weren't going to do anything for black voters, then it wouldn't be long at all before the Orange Man, or somebody just as bad, decided to stumble and bumble their way right back into the White House. And when I saw the avalanche of prosecutions and litigation that came against Trump, I knew then and there the only hope that he had to avoid any of it was to get back into the White House. So to me, it was a fait accompli he would at least try. All right, that's a brief summary of what's happened the last week, or rather the last 10 years. So where do the Democrats go from here, you might be wondering? As a political party, don't expect them to discover religion. They attack the new voices of black media on the rare occasions that they weren't desperately trying to ignore us. Americans as a group have notoriously short memories. That's largely because the white media has conditioned them to. They're going to try to subject hop and change the subject and do whatever else they can. Expect to see some Hollywood actor or singer, black of course, who's going to be in the headlines for a bad reason, and the white media is going to go on an orgy of publicity and obsession about that. I guess P. Diddy's going to be dominating for a while, but that's what the white media is going to be trying to do in the near term, to try to whitewash their image, get people talking about something else other than how putridly biased that they were and how they got everything wrong again. But the crisis of credibility that the white media is facing seems tame by comparison to what the Democrats have ahead of them. Right now, I'll bet you Gavin Newsom smiling with those phony teeth of his and preparing his campaign announcement speech, which I'm sure will probably be on MLK Day. He has the charisma that Kamala didn't, but he also has all of her political liabilities too. Well, except for shacking up with low-down Willie Brown. But don't be surprised when Gavin Newsom's name inevitably starts getting thrown around, probably by next summer, though I think it'll be far sooner than that. You can never start campaigning for the presidency too early. Gavin Newsom didn't have a serious chance of being the nominee this time around, and I'm sure that he's the happiest person in the world that Kamala Harris lost, the same way that Barack Obama was ready to dance a jig when John Kerry lost the election back in 2004. This is how the bootlick shills and operatives make way for themselves. They wait to see who's going to make it and who doesn't. But we're going to have to make sure that we educate people about Gavin Newsom's record. We cannot leave this to chance. The same way that I started banging the drum early against Kamala Harris, we're going to be doing the same thing about Gavin Newsom. Assuming that he gets any sort of steam behind him, we want to make sure that by the time he actually gets his name out there, People already know about his past. We don't want him trying to rewrite his putrid history. And speaking of rewriting history, those bought and paid for corrupt scumbags that you got out there in California crippling the effort for reparations, they need to be put on blast as well. Everyone is going to have to be held to account. But don't forget the fact that Gavin Newsom has been the little ringleader of the anti-reparations movement out there. We want to make sure that his name becomes synonymous with that because that's exactly who and what he is. We got to make it where people start suffering and paying a price for getting in the way of our interest. Anybody who defies us, they have to be made to pay a price. That's how you condition people not to stand against your interest. You do it by making sure that you consistently leverage consequences for those who do. Now, Gavin Newsom's name is going to be coming up quite a bit, I imagine, but another name that's going to start getting thrown about, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Why do you think he was ready to jump out a window to stick up for Israel? He's trying to line up his AIPAC donors early as possible. In fact, I expect him to be the most vocal and aggressive self-promoter for the presidency. As he sees it, he got swindled out of his shot to run in 2024, and his state, while it is a swing state, it's not the largest state in the country like California is. So as he sees it, he's already starting off quite a few steps behind the man from Sacramento. But Josh Shapiro's had people telling him that he's a presidential contender for the last few years, and it's gone to his head. But regardless, he has Hillary Clinton syndrome. As he sees it, it is his time. He's the white media's darling, and it shows. Don't be surprised at all if and when Josh Shapiro stops doing his aw shucks, salt of the earth kind of routine and starts talking a lot more like John Fetterman. Because that's the thing that Josh Shapiro's been trying to do. Well, I'm basically a folksy kind of down-to-earth guy with occasionally sharp elbows. But before it's all over, expect him to start doing the same kind of hard rhetoric that John Fetterman does, complete with race baiting, because Josh Shapiro owes his gubernatorial seat to the fact that black voters put him in office, and he did not say even one syllable of gratitude for black voters in Pennsylvania. This is exactly what Doug Jones did when he won that Senate seat down in Alabama, the same thing that AOC did when she got her seat in Congress, same thing Gretchen Whitmer did when she became governor of Michigan. This is what the Democrats do. Black voters put them in office, and then they promptly show us their behinds. Well, as black people, we have to make sure that whenever these people call themselves showing us their behinds, we promptly kick them in it. Now, Josh Shapiro, as he sees it, he's got a real shot at getting the golden nod 4 years from now, and when Kamala passed him over to be her VP running mate, he took that as a slap in the face, but also as an attempt to deny what he sees as his inevitable path to the White House. He couldn't deny it. As much undue attention as the white media has been giving this guy, article after article, cable news story after news story, all of them saying the same thing, non-stop message of Josh Shapiro is going to be Kamala's running mate, and then she passed him over without so much as a by your leave. He didn't just lose a vice presidential spot, he lost face too. All these people care about is acquiring ever more power. If you get in the way of that, then you've made an enemy out of them. The Democrats simply cannot win the presidency without Pennsylvania. That's part of the reason why they like having these political balances the way that they are. As Democrats see it, when it comes to controlling voters, especially black voters, it's much more useful to have a purple state than a solidly blue one. Because if it's solidly blue, well, the Democrats then have absolutely no excuse for all the stuff they do not producing for black voters. On the other hand, if the state is purple, or occasionally flashes red, well, then they can say, well, we can't do anything for you. Why, look at those Republicans. We got to spend all of our time and all of our effort making sure we hold on to power. Well, what do you do to hold on to power? Well, we're going to produce for everyone except for you black voters. So understand that. When it comes to whipsawing black voters against their interest, it's far more useful to the Democrats to actually have a strong Republican Party that's actually viable to win seats as opposed to one who's completely and thoroughly beaten and broken. Look at California if you want an example of that. And Florida is essentially out of play these days. It's pretty much solidly blood red now. There are those who say that Arizona could be a toss-up state one day. Yeah, well, today ain't going to be that day. And as for Georgia, you can give that one up. This is history repeating itself. See, many years ago, there was another aspiring young presidential wannabe who made all the right noises for the party nomination, when in reality he was desperately praying the nominee would lose so he could go ahead and run for the presidency himself. That, of course, was Barack Obama. He successfully used his speech that he gave at the 2004 DNC convention as his own political debut. He sought to make a splash and present himself as having presidential chops. His little bit of political theater worked. And the only people who were praying harder than George W. Bush for a Kerry defeat was Barack Obama. And no sooner than the results were called for the 2004 election than Obama was already going back on his promise not to seek higher office until after he served his full term as senator. He told a bald-faced lie, which was only the first of many. Only 2 years into his term, he was in Illinois pretending to walk in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and announcing his candidacy for the president. "There's no honor among thieves" is the moral of the story. Or, to use a quote from Richard Nixon, "This game isn't played by the rules, it's played by the headlines." Gavin Newsom knows he's not getting any younger, and if he can't make a run for the presidency in the next 4 years, hell, he might as well not try at all. And as for Josh Shapiro, just like Barack Obama, I'm sure he's got his Shapiro 2028 bumper stickers in the trunk of his car ready to go. And he's no doubt got some campaign stump speech made up and the talking points ready for the white media that he could be history-making, the first Jewish president of the United States. But one thing's for sure, no matter which one of these puppets the Democrat Party tries to put up, as black voters, we cannot go back on the stance that we have taken. The goal of decoupling our vote from either political party has to be maintained. The black vote has to be bid for. We got to condition people. You cannot get the black vote unless you come to us and you got to put something on the table. They're waiting to see whether or not we're going to change our minds. If they send out enough bootlicks, if they send out enough Al Sharptons and Joy Reids, if they send out enough Donna Brazils and other bought and paid for scumbags, they want to see whether or not our resolve is going to weaken. Especially if they start screaming, "Oh, black voters, you're in danger of being ignored. They're going to start ignoring you if you don't get back on board." They've been ignoring us while we've been on board the entire time. So don't let any scare talk frighten you. Don't let your knees get to knocking now. The super objective, of course, is going to be not having anybody coming up to us whether or not we're going to be bargaining. We're going to be in a position where we get what we want regardless of who's on the ticket, especially if we start making sure we got our folks on there. That's where this goes next. We don't want a situation where we're constantly sitting here having to read the tea leaves about which puppet is going to be running for the office, who's going to be getting the nomination. We need to make it a point to establish a real dynamic where no matter who loses, we win, and where our interests are always on the ballot because we made sure that they are. But in closing, I'm going to say this. We've been hearing for the last 4 years or so that Donald Trump is going to be ushering in a Fourth Reich and that democracy is going to go down the tubes. Well, let me tell you something. Just on the off chance that the orange man does have brown shirts ready to go, the people who are to blame for this are the Democrats themselves. They were the ones who actually were telling people that this stuff was going to happen. And if the situation was as dire as they were saying, it should have been a very easy, pig simple choice for them to come to black voters and say, "We need your help to keep this from happening. America stands on the brink." Instead, what did they do? They tried to ignore us. They tried to harass and harangue us. And when all else failed, they sent out their favorite biracial bootlick and his hag of a wife to sit here and finger wag at us and to insult us and call us names and tell us what they weren't going to do for us. They attacked us. They didn't attack the orange man. They attacked us. So what does that tell you? As they see it, the real enemy here are not the Republican Party. The real threat to democracy is not the GOP or any would-be prospective American fascism. The real threat to American democracy is that black voters might actually make it happen. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Hildman Gallo, Shiva Boone, Cedric Dillard, Richard Foster, and Isaac. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.